Support for environmental policy has never been higher. Students, business leaders, and politicians are all on board with reducing carbon emissions and pivoting away from an extraction-based economy. At the same time, the scale of the problem seems to grow larger every day. And yet, while many of us want to live in a more sustainable lifestyle, we continue to operate under old ways of thinking that, in the long run, will prove incompatible with an environmental mindset. To understand what environmental thought gets wrong, let's look at a major discovery that made the media rounds last year. A study published in Nature found that the weight of all human-made products outweighed natural products, or as a BBC presenter put it,
"The entire weight of plastics, bricks and other human-made things is soon set to overtake that of all living organisms on Earth, such as plants and animals."
In their report, concrete, plastic, and other industrial materials are contrasted with an undefined, undifferentiated biomass, which incorporates all plant and wild animal life. This implies that the world can be neatly divided into a dichotomy where things are either from nature, and therefore non-human, or from culture, and therefore human-made. But surely no one really believes that we can divide the world up like this. So-called natural biomass is in reality made up of industrially planted trees which are grown purely for human use, and enclosed fields where woodland has been replaced with monocrop plantations. Even where there is so-called wild nature, in rainforests and deserts, decades of nuclear bomb testing has spread radiation and climatic disturbance worldwide. There is no inch of Earth that is not influenced by human activity. This is the failure of modern environmental thought. We continue to make farcical distinctions between human and natural things, and fail to see how the world as a whole has been manipulated by human hands for centuries. What's more, this fantasy ignores the last 5 centuries of colonial trade, slavery, and conquest. From the so-called discovery of the Americas in the 15th century, European nations began an unprecedented process of transatlantic travel and resource extraction. In what is often called the Columbian Exchange, plants from the New World and the Old World were shipped thousands of miles from their source of origin. Before the Columbian Exchange, potatoes, peppers, and tomatoes were utterly unknown within Eurasia and Africa. These plants were brought to the Old World through shipping routes, whose primary aims were colonial expansion, slave trafficking, and capital creation. Biomass became a political and economic extension of human activity, and the ubiquity of these crops must also be seen as neither human culture or purely natural. These plants, people, and resources that were trafficked across the Atlantic were categorized as natural. Slaves were stripped of their humanity and considered as non-human, which justified their exploitation in the eyes of contemporaries. This shows that the human-nature dichotomy is also one of power, where what is human has a right to exist, and what is natural is a resource to be exploited. In this way then, biomass became a political and economic extension of human activity, and the ubiquity of these crops must neither be seen as purely human culture or purely natural. To say human-made material outweighs natural materials is therefore wrong on 2 fronts. It is a violent farce to divide the world into nature culture, or non-human human. Further, of the human-made materials and the Earth's biomass, it is the global north and European colonists and colonies that are responsible. We can see this in a map which weights extinct plants and species, where colonized lands have been drastically reduced of their biodiversity, and then compare this to carbon footprints of nations, where the carbon footprint of the global north vastly outweighs that of the global south. To place the blame for the destruction of the Earth's climate on humanity at large is absurd, when the people of colonized lands were considered inhuman or inferior to those considered white. As long as we keep dividing things along the human-non-human divide, there can be no effective environmentally friendly behaviour. One solution to this problem has been to expand the concept of human rights onto sentient and non-sentient things. Several rivers and lakes are now legally considered to be people, with full protection under the law. But this merely enforces the idea that non-human beings can be used and abused, while human beings have a right to exist. The category of human has and always will be an instrument of exclusion. In the age of climate crisis then, the concept of a human and the concept of nature needs to be done away with. In its place, there is room for a new imagination, a reimagining of what we are and how we impact the world. There is no easy solution to this problem, but instead long and complicated conversations are needed for us to understand how to live going forward.